friends. Welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling, and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be understanding and dealing with the concept of managing cycle time reduction. The learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by managing the cycle time reduction, what are the various roles and of operations planning in managing the cycle time reductions? And lastly, understand as to how do we reduce the managing of cycle time reductions. Now let's begin with our learning. Firstly, we'll understand what do we mean by managing the cycle time reduction. The cycle time, which means the time between both the output of two consecutive flow units, is referred to as the cycle. That is, the time taken between the two served customers or two treated patients is called as the cycle time. So in a manufacturing organization, when we need to conduct any activity, the time that has been taken between a process of activity for an input and output is called as the cycle time. And in an organization, when the output or input is been flowed from one machine to another machine, one assembly line to another assembly line, we need to identify what is the time that is been required for the flow of materials. And the calculation of time required for the flow of materials from one level to another level is called as the cycle time. It is always the same as the longest process step time that has been undertaken. So always the cycle time is different for different products or different activities, and we need to assess and identify as to what is the time that has been identified for different products, different commodities, and different processes that we are undertaking. The concept of managing the cycle time reduction focuses on three perspectives. The first perspective is cycle time reduction. The second perspective is the business reengineering, and the third perspective is the TQM, that is total quality management. Now let's understand what are the various procedures or activities that have been followed in cycle time reduction. So in case of a cycle time reduction, in this particular chart, you can see the various activities that have been undertaken or the steps that have been implemented for cycle time reduction are: number one, the concept of change management, configurable and customizable. So we must have a positive change managed perspectives in which the change that is been required as and when it is been needed, those things must be implemented and used in the business organization or the manufacturing unit. The second perspective focuses on reducing the critical path. So whatever critical path that we have identified, we must always try to reduce the critical path in a business organization, and all our activities must be streamlined and must be conducted in a shortest time duration. The third perspective focuses on delivering less with the high quality. So we must always deliver the goods and services with the high qualitative perspectives. And from those concerns in the organization, we must identify as to how do we deliver the better quality of goods and services in the long run as well as in the short run. The next perspective is the mindset to create a masterpiece. So we must have a mindset to create a masterpiece in which the business organization must understand and must identify as to how do we create a mindset for creating a better qualitative products in the long run as well as in the short run. The next perspective is more generalist than a specialist. So we must have a more generalist approach than a specialized approach, which focuses on delivering the qualitative products to the customers and how do we identify and create a better constitution as to the delivering of better products in a better considerable situation. The next the sixth point or the procedure activity that can be performed is continuously analyze the end-to-end workflow. So we must always analyze and create how do we create the end-to-end workflow activities, and every activity must be planned in a very sequential way. Only when we have a proper sequence and plan of activities, we can have an analysis of the works and it can be continued in a very better and effective way. The seventh step or activity that can be undertaken is value-added acceptance criteria. So always the manufacturing activity that we are conducting, the cycle time must be reduced and we must always try to create the value addition for the acceptance criterion that has been provided. The eighth perspective focuses on doneness by the end user. So every activity that has been undertaken by the end user, it must be completed within the specified time period, and a special focus must be given by the end users as to how do we complete those activities in the specified timeline or the deadline. The ninth activity focuses on removing the impediments continuously. So whatever impediments, hurdles that have been observed or any changes that have been observed in a business organization or the manufacturing cycle, we must try to remove those impediments, and continuous improvement activity as to Kaizen needs to be improvised and needs to be undertaken. The 10th activity or the process focuses on stop repeating a similar mistake. So we must not create the various mistakes that have been occurring on a regular basis, and we must stop repeating the mistakes which are very often happened or which are very often to be observed in a business situation. So we must always stop to repeat a particular mistake, and reduction of mistakes is especially important. The 11th activity focuses on start early testing and the early feedback. So we must always start a particular activity at an early stage. We must have an early testing, and early feedback must also be taken so that we can have a proper planning as to if any changes or certain consideration with respect to the changes in the business environment and consideration needs to be undertaken, then we can have an early feedback from those considerations. The 12th activity focuses on reducing the rework, increasing the reuse. So it always focuses on how do we reduce the rework activities and how do we increase the reuse activities. So a proper balance between the rework and reuse needs to be undertaken. So these are the various steps for the cycle time reduction, due to which we can reduce the cycle time in an organization and all the activities can be streamlined and can be completed within a specific time period. Now let us understand what are the various processes that have been followed in case of a cycle time reduction. So the first step that we need to undertake is identifying the operational process steps. So when we have what we need to do is what are the various operational process or steps that have been undertaken and how those activities can be performed are the considerations of identifying the operational process steps. And these are the identification is essentially required. After the identification of process steps, we need to identify what are the process steps cycle times that have been consumed by each and every level of activity. So on the basis of identification of the cycle times, one needs to consider and identify as to what implementations can be taken and how do we can identify the process step cycles in the long run as well as in the short term perspectives. The third perspective is identifying the required person. So whatever personnel that has been required in business organization, we must always try to identify those personnel, and the employment of people for those consideration needs to be undertaken in a better way. So that is the example of identifying the personnel. The next perspective focuses on identifying the required equipment. So whatever equipment that has been required, we must identify that particular equipment, and the arrangement of those equipment needs to be maintained and needs to be created for the better consideration. The next fifth perspective focuses on identifying the yield and cumulative effect. So what is the yield and what is the cumulative effect that can be created and how we can control all those activities in a business organization and manufacturing cycle. So for reduction of the cycle time in a business organization, how do we identify those effects and how the yield, that is the productivity, is also being improvised and created in the better consideration. The sixth activity of this step focuses on identifying the constraint points, wherein what are the various major important considerations and points that we need to remember and how to implement those constraint points in the organization is essentially needed to be identified. The next perspective focuses on identifying the corrective actions on which basis the various actions needs to be implemented and how do we conduct those activities for the better consideration of qualitative productivity and the consideration. The cycle time reduction focuses on always taking the corrective actions and how we can implement those corrective actions in the long run as well as in the short run for the better connectivity and improving of goods, services, commodities, and qualitative products in the business organization. The eighth activity focuses on implementing and measuring the results on which basis we can identify what results needs to be undertaken and how do we implement those results and decisions that are being undertaken. And lastly, the ninth activity focuses on updating the KPI, that is key performance indicators. So whatever key performance indicators have been identified, we need to conduct those resources as to updation of those KPIs and how those KPIs can be accepted or can be adopted in business organization for the better productivity and better performance in the long run. Now let's understand what are the various cycle time reduction that gives life to the productivity. So the concept of cycle time reduction that gives life to the productivity are only production is not important. We must always look for the client request. So what request is being provided by the client, what he is expecting from a particular organization or the product, and the consumer that he is making a request or that particular request is being fulfilled or not. So the organization must not only focus on the production activities, and they must always simultaneously focus on what request is being provided and how do we fulfill or provide those requests in a certain consideration. Reducing inventory at all stages of the processes, but particularly in the work in progress and the completed goods inventory. So we must always try to reduce the amount of inventory that is being used in a business organization, and how do we have a control on all the work in progresses, that is WIP. And lastly, the completing of goods and inventories in better situation as to qualitative manufacturing of product that has been undertaken. Setting the objectives and track progress against the customer relevant benchmarks. So we must always set the objectives and always track what is the process against the relevant benchmarks that we have set. So making a comparison as to the product that is manufactured and what we have budgeted and what was the standards that was being set that needs to be achieved. Now let's understand what is the framework for the better control of the goods and services in an organization as to the cycle time reduction. The orders are balanced against the capacity, so they don't miss their promises and they can't be kept. So we must always see that whatever balanced have been, whatever orders have been there, they have been balanced in against the capacity, and all the manufacturing capacity is being utilized, and all the orders have been fulfilled. They have been promised and delivered as per the requirements. Getting rid of the work in progress backlog so that they can process each and every order quickly. So we must always watch and have a control on the work in progress activities, where so as to see that there is no backlog activity that has been created and each and every process order is being completed within a specific time period. So completion of each and every activity within a specified time period is essential and important. The next framework focuses on creating an atmosphere in which management and employees collaborate to achieve the common goals. Whatever common goals that have been there, that have been associated in a business organization, that goals must be achieved. And from the achievement of those particular goals, we must have a certain consideration as to how do we control those activities, and we must create an environment for the better collaboration between the management and between the employees or the people or the shop floor employees. The stuff that does not build up in the warehouse waiting for orders manufacturing is based on current demand. So what is the current demand for a certain market, and what is the amount of raw material or inventory that is available for the production of those goods and services in the warehouse and the inventory level. Now let's understand what are the various applications of the operational plan in the cycle time reduction. So the various applications for the operational plan reduction is applicable with respect to the processing time, the movement time, the waiting time, and lastly, the inspection time. So reduction of the total time taken from the start of the production to its service completion are based on 4 factors. That is the processing, the movement, the waiting, and the inspection time. Now let's understand what does successful CTR, that is cycle time reduction, leads to. The first perspective is 60 to 90% of reduction in the lead time, 30 to 50% of reduction in the manufacturing floor space, 40 to 80% of reduction in the total quality cost, 50 to 90% reduction in the setup times and the lot sizes, 95 to 100% of promises met on every shift. So these are the various successful CTR that leads to the control on the business activities with respect to the lead time, the manufacturing floor space, the total quality cost, the setup time and the lot size, and the shift management. So cycle time reduction is always tried and true approach for a manufacturing concern to have a competitive advantage in terms of pricing, quality, lead time, and on-time delivery. In a business organization, it is very necessary to see that how do we control the cycle time reduction, and it increases or it benefits the organization in the long run for the pricing, quality, lead times, and so on. Cycle time reduction is a continuous activity that focuses on strong managerial support, changes in the tough production activity, and how better results can be created for or in a controlling environment or in a strong market position. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood what do we mean by managing the cycle time reduction, which planning has been required in case of a cycle time reduction, and lastly, how do we implement the managing of cycle time reduction. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning in this particular session. We'll stay connected and we'll continue with our learning. Thank you.